Hello, welcome back to another Coding Basics video. In this one we're going to be creating this little counter in JavaScript and HTML with some CSS styling. It's pretty basic. You've got an input for your counter display, an increment button which when you press it goes up by 1 each time, and a decrement button which when you press it, it takes 1 away each time. This one should only be a quick one and it's pretty simple to get going, but hopefully you enjoy it, so let's get into it. So here I am in Visual Studio Code as always. I'm going to start by creating 3 files in the sidebar here. So you can see there we've got the create file button, so I'm going to go ahead and create myself an index.html page. I'm also going to create a counter.js file, and I'm going to create a counter.css file. So let's get started with this. The first thing we need to do is create our little interface, which is going to be the decrement button, the counter display, and the increment button. So we're going to create this in index.html. If you have Emmet installed for Visual Studio Code, or I think in Visual Studio Code you can do this without any extension, so I'm just going to type an exclamation mark and I'm going to press tab, and what that's going to do is just put some base HTML in there for us. So you can see obviously all the dot type and HTML declaration and things like that are all put in for us without us having to type anything out, so that's a neat little shortcut if you didn't know about it. I'm just going to change the title of the page to counter and save that off. So first things first, we need to create our decrement button, so we're going to go button type equals button with a class of counter button and a class of red, and then we're going to give this an ID of decrement, and then we're just going to put the hyphen or subtract symbol in there. Cool. So the next thing we need is our increment button. That's the one that's going to make the counter go up. So all I'm going to do is duplicate this line that we've just written here by holding Control and pressing C and then V straight after it, and you can see that duplicates the line. We're just going to change this up so that it's our increment button, so I'm going to change the ID to increment. I'm going to give a plus sign in here rather than a subtract sign, and I'm going to change this to green. These are CSS classes. We don't need to worry about these yet. We're going to write these later on. This is just going to change the look and feel of these buttons. These IDs are what we're going to use to target the buttons with JavaScript. So the next thing that we need is our counter display, which is just going to be input type number, because obviously we're going to display numbers in there. We're going to give this an ID of counter-display, and we're going to set this to a default value of 0. That's the value that this input is going to have when a page loads, and we're going to disable this input. The reason we are disabling this input is because we want people to use the buttons to increment and decrement the counter value. So when we set this to disabled, it means that people can't just type anything into the field directly. So that's our index.html page done with our little interface. The next thing we're going to do on here is just include our JavaScript file. So I'm just going to say script src, and we're just going to point this at counter.js, and all that's going to do is make it so that any JavaScript code we write in this counter.js file is accessible by this HTML. So I'm just going to move into the counter.js file now. So you can see this is just a blank JavaScript file. So in here we're going to write the JavaScript that's going to make the counter work. We're going to be writing some functions, and we're going to be declaring some event listeners so that when the buttons are clicked, things happen. So the first things first, we need a function to be able to get the current value of the counter, and we need this in order to be able to increment and decrement the counter by 1 each time, because we need to know what the current value is to be able to take 1 away from it or add 1 to it. So I'm just going to declare this function now. So I'm going to say function get current counter value. It doesn't take any arguments, and all this is going to do is return us a number. So it's going to return us a value with a data type of number, and that value is going to be document get element by ID counter display dot value. So let's just go through this code. So we've declared the function get current counter value. You'll see how we use this later on if you're not familiar with functions. And this function is going to return a value which has a data type of number, and that value is going to be picked up from this input here, and that's what this bit of code here does, the document.getElement by ID. This looks at the whole HTML document and it will target any elements on the page which have this ID. So this function here is going to look at our HTML, it's going to read it all, and then it's going to keep going down and look at all the different elements on it. So it's going to see buttons and inputs, and when it hits this input here, it's going to go, got an ID of counter display, this is the one that we want, what's the value? And it's going to return the value here, and that's done by using this property, the value property. So the next thing we need is a function to set the counter value. So just like getting the value, once we've added or taken one away from it, we need to be able to set that and put that back into the counter display. So I'm just going to declare another function. I'm going to call this function set counter value, and this one is going to take an argument of new value, which is going to be the value that we're going to put into this element here. So all we're going to say here, we're not going to return anything from this function, it's just going to do something for us. So once again, I'm going to say document.getElement by ID. So once again, we're targeting that counter display input in order to be able to manipulate it and do things with it. And we're going to set the value property to whatever the new value is that's being passed in. So this will update that value property, just like we use the value property to get it here. It's going to update the value property to whatever this value here is, which is the one that we've passed in. So this is going to be the value which is the current value plus or minus 1. So the next thing we need to do is set up two functions for our increment and decrement buttons. What this is going to mean is that when those buttons are pressed, those functions are going to be called by the event listener, and they're going to add or take away one from the counter value as necessary. So once again, we're just going to declare a function, and we're going to call this Increment Counter. So this is the one that's going to make it go up. Once more, takes no arguments, and in this one we're going to use the two functions that we've already declared here. So I'm going to say var current value equals get current counter value, and then I'm going to set counter value to current value plus 1, and that's it. It's as simple as that to increment our counter. So we use this function here, the get current counter value, to get whatever is in the counter display at the given time the button is pressed, and we assign the value that's returned from this function to this variable, and then we use this function here, the set counter value function that we wrote, to override whatever is in that field with the current value plus 1. So similarly, we're going to create our decrement counter. So I'm going to declare another function, decrement counter, and this is more of the same. So the current value, once again using those functions that we wrote, to get the current value and then to set a new value. The only difference this time is we're going to take away 1 rather than add 1. So we're going to subtract 1 from the current value rather than add 1. And that's it for counter.js. It's as simple as that. You might have thought there were more to it, but no. It's pretty quick, pretty easy. So if we open our index.html page in Chrome now, you can see that we've got our little interface with the subtract button and the add button and our little counter display. when we press these buttons, you'll see that nothing happens. So I'm adding, nothing's happening. I'm subtracting, nothing's happening. And this is because we've yet to add our event listeners to the counter.js file. Now the event listeners are just that. They listen for events happening on the page. So an event is something like clicking a button or changing some text in an input. And the listeners wait for those events to happen and then fire off some functions that we define. So let's go and add those event listeners now so that our buttons actually do something. So back in VS Code in our counter.js file, we're just going to quickly add those event listeners so that the buttons do something. So I'm just going to target those two button elements. So we've got the increment and decrement buttons. So let's target them with the document getElementById function. And we're going to say decrement dot add event listener. Click, and we're going to point this to our function that we've defined. Once more, I'm just going to duplicate this line by holding Control and pressing C and V straight after it, and you can see that duplicates the line. I'm going to change this to increment, and I'm going to change this function to increment counter. So just to break this down once again, using the document getElementById function, we're targeting that element of the page, so we're targeting the button and we're adding an event listener to that button. And that event that we're listening for is the button being clicked. And whenever that button's clicked, we're going to fire off this function, which is the one that we've declared here, to take one away from our counter. So coming back into Chrome now, I'm just going to refresh so that we get the most up-to-date code loaded into the browser, and let's try out our buttons and see if they add and take away from our counter value. So add 1, and you can see it changes to 1. Add another 2, 3, 4, 5. So let's try the subtract button now. And so we should get 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Excellent, that works. So the last thing we're going to do is we're just going to jazz this up a little bit with some CSS and make it look nice. So in VS Code now, I'm just going to head into the counter.css file that we set up earlier, and this is where we're going to style our buttons and our input to make them look just a little bit prettier than what they do currently. Now you can style this however you want. I'm just going to add some quick styling just to make it look pretty, but you might be using something like Bootstrap or another front-end framework that this might already be done for you, but just for completeness of this tutorial, I'm just going to make it look a bit nicer. So we're going to use CSS to target our input. So I'm going to target the input by its ID. So I'm going to say hash counter display. I'm going to give this some padding. So let's just call it 10 pixels. I'm going to give it a border, 1 pixel in width, and it's going to be a solid border, and it's going to be a dark grey. Let's give it some rounded corners now, just to make it look a bit neater or a bit nicer. So I'm just going to say border radius of 4 pixels, and let's just set the font size so it's a little bit bigger, a little bit easier to read. I'm just going to call it 16 pixels. So onto our buttons now. So we're going to create a few different classes for this. If you remember, we've got counter button, which is one class, and red, which is another class, and then green, which is a third class. The reason that we've done it like this is so that we can use counter button to add some base styling, so we don't have to style each of these buttons individually when we're wanting to change the colour of them, because we want the subtract button to be red and the add or increment button to be green. So jump back into counter CSS, and we're going to target these buttons now. So we're going to target it by the type of element, which is button, and we're going to say counter button. We're going to give this some padding to match the counter display of 10 pixels. We're going to up the font size once more to match the counter display, so we're going to call that 16 pixels. We're going to give this a border of 1 pixel. Actually, no, let's not give it a border. We don't need a border. We don't need one. Actually, no. On second thought, we will give it a border. of 1 pixel solid, and we'll just make this black for now, or really dark grey. What else? What else? I think that'll be alright. Border radius. Let's give it a border radius so it matches our input, our counter display, just so it looks nice and neat. So we'll match that with 4 pixels. So now we're going to create those red and green classes. So we're going to say button.counterbutton.red. So this is going to target any buttons which have the counter button class and also the red class. We're going to say background color red, and then we're going to do border color of red, like so. You could use the hex values in here. I'm just typing red because it's easier. You can also use the color picker if you're using VS Code. So lastly, we're going to create that green button. So we're going to say button counter button dot green once more with the background color, which is going to be let's go with green, and the border color of green. And one thing I forgot, we're going to change the text color to white just to make it look a little bit better. Last thing we need to do, now we've got our CSS written, is just jump back into index and include this CSS file so that the elements within this page can be modified or transformed by the CSS that we've written in here. So into index.html, I'm just going to type link and press tab, and we're just going to say counter.css in there, and that should link everything up for us. So just jumping back into Chrome, let's give that a refresh, and you can see we've got a nice counter now with some with our nice input display with the padding and bigger font size and the nice green button and the red button. So let's just check it all still works. So +1, 2, 3, 4, and then take away, go back to 0. And that's everything. That's your little counter written in JavaScript. You could enhance this, so currently it does go into negatives. It's up to you whether you want it to still go into negative numbers. You could always fiddle around with the JavaScript and put a check in to make sure that it can't go into negative figures, but that's totally up to you. I'm not going to cover that in this video. I'll let you go and Google that and find that, or play around and figure out how to do that one for yourself. So I hope you enjoyed this video. It's only a little quick one. These coding basics ones are just fun for me, just fun little exercises. So if you liked it, drop a like down below. If you've got any suggestions of little things you want me to cover, drop that in the comments, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.